Good morning, everyone. The FRC, the Food Recovery Council, brings you session 3 of the Maine Master Community Composter course presented by Mark King. He's the Organics Management Specialist, Division of Materials Management, Maine DEP. He's had this role for 30 years, and he's a well-known authority on composting. Who we are, we're like-minded individuals with a goal in mind, minimizing food waste. We hope this class helps with that. How to get involved? You can shoot us an email, talk to us, call us on the phone, however you want to do it. We are working on a survey still to see what people need out there. So we have the grant program deadline approaching, 4 p.m., April 13. Get your grants in. After that, no more questions. And this certificate will for taking this course will help you demonstrate technical ability, which is required when applying for the permit by rule for the Maine DEP. You can add on later, just have to keep up with your DEP rep to make sure you know how that works. Individuals completing all 5 webinars, in the last video, you could take our 50 question certification exam if you'd like. There's a small charge to that, but all these classes are free if you don't want to be certified. And you're just going to get a passing
the test
score.
is free too.
Say that again?
The test is free. It's just the certification.
Right, you take the test, and then if you want to get the goodies and get the certificate and all that, then you pay a little bit of money and we get that off to you.
Yep.
So February 26th, we talked about the feedstock and recipe, and today's class, compost methods and systems. If you do have questions, because you watch the videos afterwards, you feel free to ask those other questions for the first 2 sessions too, and we'll do that at the end. And the 4th series will be the building and managing your compost pile. We're going to do that April 14th at the Samoset, but those that won't be able to attend, we're going to bring that to you live from the event. So, and then the 5th and final video series, I won't go through the whole thing, but it'll show you about the piles, recipe development. Mark will do a little troubleshooting. I'll ask dumb questions at the sites to see, what's going on. So just remember, these are free webinars to watch. You can watch them as many times as you want, and you can watch them later on. Just our little poster. We're still working on our the request for the pilot program with the carts. Mark and I are going to come up with some ways to make that work better for you. Anyone interested?
Yep.
So then we got Mark's contact info. Maine Compost School. We got the Division of Materials Management. There's his phone number. I'll probably bring that up later at the end again in case you didn't see it. Maine Food, obviously too good to waste. And we'll turn this program over to Mark and learn some stuff about composting. Now I'm going to stop sharing, and then Mark can start sharing.
Awesome.
All right.
All right. So let's see here. All right. And then let's see here. I think I have to let me close over here to start it. Okay, here, slideshow from beginning. All right, everybody see that okay? Or do I need to share it again? Are you seeing the slide or are you seeing my note slides?
We're seeing your note slides.
Okay, so what I need to do then is I need to stop sharing. And then I'll do this right here. Okay, share. All right, now you seeing the right one?
Yes, sir.
All right, cool. Okay, so I always want to start off the show by talking about what we covered in the previous slide, in the previous class. So what we learned from the Feedstock 101 class, the first thing we learned is that all feedstocks are not created equal. For example, if you look at carbon, like a wood product, you can have a carbon to nitrogen ratio of like 400 to 1 for a piece of paper, for a chunk of wood, for shavings, and for sawdust. So the only way you're going to know how to work in the pile is by actually visiting the site where it's generated taking a look at it, touching it, feeling it, and then taking a sample of it and sending that off to the lab for an analysis. So you really need to have eyes on your product. We also learned about the 6 major characteristics that affect how a compost pile works. The carbon to nitrogen ratio, knowing that ahead of time, as we develop our recipe, we can get to that balanced range of 20 to 30 to 1. As far as moisture content, we want to know what the moisture is of each item. So when we put them together, we can get a ratio of around 50 to 65%. 55% is the sweet spot. We also want to know that particle size, the texture. That's once again getting your hands on it, because we want a mixture of coarse and fine. The coarse helps to build the pile structure, and the fine is what absorbs all of the nutrients, the liquids, and it's also the food source for the microbes, what they can get on top of and feed on due to the particle size. The smaller it is, the more surface area that's available. We also talked about bulk density. We want somewhere around 800,000 pounds per cubic yard for each item so that they blend well together. If you have a really wet and a really dry, light, fluffy product, when you go to mix it, it's just going to make balls, little coconuts and things. So we want to have compatible bulk densities and compatible textures so they mix well. Salinity wise, it's not really a super huge deal. If you end up with something that's much higher than 4 millimoles per centimeter, you can often spread it out and drench it, and that will help to take care of the salinity. It kind of washes it out. Or you can mix it with another feedstock that is low in salinity and kind of dilute it. But usually that's not an issue. And we really kind of look at that more at the end for the end use of the product, because if it has a high salinity, it's going to rob water from any plants that it's used on. So we want to make sure it's less than 4 millimoles per centimeter at the end. And then finally, pH. And pH is really only an issue if it is really either super basic or super acidic, because normally the pile will tend to buffer itself. So if it's anywhere between like 5.5 and 8.5, it's going to come close to between 7 and 8.2 when it's all done. So we don't really worry about pH as much as others do. Then we talked about the importance of proper mixing and bulking of materials to make sure the process works well. We talked about moisture content. We want that 55%. We talked about having good pile structure so air can flow through. So that's the porosity piece. If you have, nice porous areas, so good structure, air is going to penetrate to the core. If you have really, really fine structure, it's going to be great for odor control, but it's not going to be great for aeration. So that's really important. We talked about the seed-end ratio. We want 20 to 30 to 1 so that the pile is going to compost well. It's the right balance of nutrients for the microbes. And also, really good mixing and bulking takes care of any potential odors or leachate. And the number one way to control odors on your site is to bulk it with amendment, absorb that liquid, and when you take the liquid away, you take away the odor. And finally, we brought up the idea of testing your finished product. It's just as important as testing your feedstocks, because what you get based on the list in bullet number 2 above, plus the maturity level, tells you what the best use for that material is. And my number one caution to new composters is never sell it for more than its value. And that's really super important. So we're going to talk basically about the systems that are out there, starting with the really small ones, going to the really big ones. So the first one is a backyard system. These are generally limited to no more than 5 cubic yards in size, and they need to be at least a cubic yard in order to maintain energy and composting throughout the winter months. Anything less than a cubic yard is prone to freezing. So that's really important. We actually did a study down at the University of New England several years back where we had compost piles, and we had one that was a cubic yard and then had some that were less, and we ran them through a winter season, and the cubic yard pile stayed hot from December right through March and kept nice high temperatures. So we published that, and that's kind of been our standard of minimum of cubic yard in order to heat through the winter for a backyard bin. They're easy to build and operate. They do take a long time to compost unless you're in there agitating all the time. Compost often is crude but usable, and it's generally people use it on site. This is a simple bin here. This is the lobster trap wire bin. It's one of my favorite systems. It's not pretty, but it has wicked good, excellent aeration. And it's what I use for a lot of things. I actually had a bin at the University of New England after a dogfish tournament where I actually put in about 10 dogfish chopped up into a bin that was 4 foot tall by 4 feet in diameter. And it got up to 165 and stayed that way. And at the end of about 4 weeks, all the dogfish bodies were gone. So it is really a great system, and it does a really good job. And the idea is it's a 12-foot section of wire that's 4 feet wide. You roll it into a cylinder, and then you use either zip ties, which I'm not a fan of, or bent wire to hold it together. Fill it to the top, and then you either let it set, like the old Ron Popeil set it and forget it roaster machine. You just let it set, or you can turn it as you want, and it'll make compost faster. If you don't turn it, in about 6 months, half of it will be compost from the bottom up. This is the other thing. I've given Victor a lot of crap over the years for the Earth machine. It doesn't have enough capacity to compost through the winter. It's attractive and it keeps out of sight, out of mind, so it appeals to a lot of people. But if you want something that's going to absolutely 100% work, the lobster trap wire bin does. It always does. It's just not pretty. And so that's kind of a key thing. But as you can see, the Earth machine's capacity is about a 0.4 cubic yard. So it's not enough to stay through the winter months. And that's kind of a critical thing. However, we are working on these possibly for pet waste composting. And that may be something that takes off and gives them a whole new market. So we're going to do some experiments with that this summer. This is a 3-bin system. Each one of these bins is 1 cubic yard. This is for the community that wants to make compost faster. And what happens is that you fill that first bin. When it's full to the top, you flip it into the second bin and you start filling the first one again. When the first one's full to the top, you flip the second to the third and the first to the second, and so on and so forth. Because you've turned it multiple times, it composts faster and it gets a better mix. So it's a much better compost product. So this is something that a lot of communities want to build. So now moving towards a different level, you still have this 3-bin system or 2-bin system, depending on what you want to do. But the bins now are 10 feet by 10 feet by 10 feet. So much larger capacity. These were designed in the 80s in Beltsville, Maryland, around the experiment station to help deal with poultry mortalities. What would happen is that they would put a layer of manure, poultry manure, a layer of birds, a layer of straw, a layer of poultry manure, a layer of birds, and they'd fill this thing right up and let it sit for 10 to 14 days to sort of pre-cure. Then what they would do is they would flip it to the second bay, do it again for another 14 days. And then that material was taken out and it was fairly crude, but most of the odor was gone, but it still had a lot of dissolved nutrients that were kind of leaching out. They would scoop that up, put it in a manure spreader and spread it on the fields. It was a way to get nutrients to the fields, but reduce the odor of the chicken manure spreading. So it was really kind of a decent idea. Well, we've actually developed a process where we added another bay. So it's 3 bays, and we let it cure or let it precondition for 2 weeks in each of the bays. And then we put it outside for curing. And I'm going to show you that in a second. But it does require lots of mixing. And from the 2-bin system, it's fairly immature. This is the facility that we built down in Biddeford at the University of New England. And we composted seal mortalities there. They had a lot of seals that came in for rehab. And if they died, they would have to do an autopsy to see what killed them. They called it a necropsy. And the parts and pieces would then come here, and we would put them in a bed of horse manure and let them sit for 2 weeks in the first bay, 2 weeks in the second bay after being flipped, flip it into the third bay and for 2 more weeks, and then flip it outside. And we'd let it cure for a month or so then they would use this material around the campus. They weren't allowed to sell it because it had marine mammal parts in it, but we've since then gotten that restriction reduced, so which is a really good thing. And then the bottom picture is actually of a 3-bin system, but in this case, these are leaves and grass clippings. And so a lot of times they don't move them from bay to bay, they move them in the same bay and just keep flipping the pile over. So kind of a good thing. So then you have what's called a static pile system. And a static pile is exactly what it says. You build a pile and you kind of let it set. This is usually done by leaf and yard mostly, and this is in most of Maine's transfer stations. We'll have something like this. It tends to be kind of a compost that's got a hodgepodge of things, branches and rocks and things like that, if it's not carefully monitored. A lot of communities just accept grass clippings and leaves from people when they do their yard cleaning. And sometimes there's, G.I. Joes and Barbie dolls that the kids left in the ground by accident. And they got stuck in the pile. So it's not really a super beautiful compost. When it's screened, it can be beautiful, but in most cases, it's not super beautiful. But our requirement in Maine, if you get a permit by rule to actually compost leaves and grass clippings, is it's got to be turned 4 times a year, and grass needs to be incorporated within 48 hours in order to make sure that it doesn't ferment and get all stinky. Usually very inexpensive. Every place has a front end loader, so that's what does most of the work. They do require a long time to finish composting, but if you don't mind, they don't mind, and they will finish on their own. There is some potential for odor generation, mostly grass clippings if they're not properly incorporated. And the other thing is that in most cases, I like to top a compost pile off at 8 feet, but with leaves, you can get even higher because they just don't have any real weight or density. In a pile where you've got like a lot of heavy stuff mixed in, if you make the pile too tall, it will compress the core. And as we learned in biology, the piles breathe from their sides up through the core and out the chimney. And if you have that compression, it actually decreases the pile's ability to compost. Little thing about collecting leaves, there's a lot of towns that have a leaf sucker. I like the fact that it collects the leaves and gets them in a location where they can be used. What I don't like is those suckers pick up a lot of sand. Sand, as we learned from the feedstock class when we looked at that series of different compost trials using bedded manure, sand has no volatile solids, so it doesn't add to the compost process and actually detracts from it. So you'll see that in the previous presentation. But building a static pile, you can use a skid steer, you use front end loader, and basically you just build it. And then, as I said, 4 times a year, you turn it. So it's not a super big deal. Now, this one I added for a little emphasis because this is how we manage mortalities. We manage either poultry mortalities or we manage with livestock mortalities. The idea is you create a bed, usually 24 inches thick of carbon. In the case of this trial that we did where we composted dairy cows, we mixed waste silage and the shavings together, 50-50 blend. But that creates a thick bed, so when the animal lets go of any nutrients, they're absorbed in the bed. Then on top of that, we got rid of the manure because in our case, the manure was contaminated with PFAS, so we had to use that. We put that on top to help kind of cook the animal on the outside as well. And then we covered it with a 36-inch layer of really good mixture of haylage and shavings. One thing we had to do was pierce the rumen of the animal, because if you don't, it'll bloat. And when the animal's legs spread apart, out will come lots of odor, and that'll attract animals, which we don't want. In the case of poultry, we do it the exact same way. The difference is that on top of the bed, we put a mixture of birds and manure. We mix them all together. Then we put the cover on top. We let them sit for 2 weeks. And we hope that within that 2 weeks, they are able to achieve 3 consecutive days at 131 degrees Fahrenheit, which is the requirement for killing the HPAI virus that's infecting these farms across the country. Then we rebuild it and another 2 weeks. And if it passes, then we as subject matter experts, that's what Mark Hedrick and I do for the federal government, can release the pile, and then that is used immediately as fertilizer because the farmers want to recover the nutrients in some way. And so it's a good thing. Then you have what's called an aerated static pile. Now, what an aerated static pile is the same thing as a static pile, except underneath it is a plenum or some way for air to be forced up through the pile to help facilitate aerobic decomposition. And we learned in biology that aerobic produces carbon dioxide, water vapor, and good compost. Anaerobic produces odors, and it's stinky, and it's wet, and it's not really productive. So that's why these systems were brought into play. So they have a supplemental blower, or you can do a passive system. You must have a very thorough homogeneous mixture, because if you don't, air will find its own way through, and those parts will get aerated, and the rest of it will be dead, and it'll be moist and stinky. So if you don't have a good blend, air is going to find the easiest way out. So we try to get a good blend. And then the odor control is usually achieved by putting a 5 to 6 inch layer of finished compost or peat moss on top to kind of scrub the odors. The reason why we add this biofilter layer, being either finished compost or peat moss, is because both have a seed-end ratio close to what the final compost will be. If I put sawdust over a pile that's already been cooking, I set the clock back to the beginning again, because I've all of a sudden changed my seed-end ratio of the recipe. Whereas with finished compost, which is around 19:1, I'm not going to upset that initial recipe. So that's kind of why we do that. Here's a shot of an aerated static pile. You've got a couple of different options. On the bottom here, you can see that I've got a blowing air system. I've got the mixture, which is the dark stuff. I'll use my pointer. That's the compost mixture. And then this is the biofilter cover. Now you'll notice that here, air is being sucked through the pile, and it then goes into a little pile to serve as a biofilter. This system is not super great, because if this blower gets short-circuited because of all the condensation and moisture, it can screw everything up. So what we prefer instead is to have the blower blow air this way and through the pile and out the top. And then this unscreened compost becomes the biofilter for odor control. And that's what we see most of what Maine does. This is another shot of that same system. You've got a bouncy house blower, PVC pipe, and all the piping actually has holes drilled in it. They put the sawdust shavings on top to act as a plenum to allow the air to expand sideways before it goes up through the pile. And it's a great design. And right here, you're talking about $49 for the blower, and maybe with the piping, although I know tariffs have really screwed things up, you're talking about maybe a couple $100. So we're talking about maybe $250, and then the timer can be expensive. Let's say $90. So for $340, you've got an aerated compost system. So it can be done fairly cheaply. I was not a fan of passive back in the day, and I'll show you some failures, but I have actually developed a method where I use a 30-yard roll-off container. I put a very thick wood chip base on the bottom, and then I place a bed of horse manure on top because it's biologically active. Then I place the mortalities on top of that, and then put a 36-inch cover of horse manure so that it's active top and bottom. Then I turn the door open and turn the vessel towards the prevailing wind so the wind blows through it. And when that happens, we get really hot temperatures. It's really exciting. So it's a great way to use a roll-off container if you happen to have one handy. But there's other ways you can get that too. In the force system, you have the same piping. You just plug air to it and blow air through it. So this is an example of some passive systems. This actually is a lady I met when I was out in Wyoming. She does a little bit of trading for her folks as well. And then this is a similar pile with leaves. This is not a good solution. This was our first Maine compost team project. We put the pipes, instead of putting them lengthwise, we put them sideways. And what happened was that we were doing horse manure and we were doing sea urchins. and the sea urchins were juicy, juicy, juicy. And they all dripped down through into those pipes. And very soon flies found them and mated and mated and mated. And in the morning, it looked like smoke was coming out of these pipes. It was thousands of flies. And so we immediately realized it was a failure, pulled the pipes, mixed the pile, and then all of a sudden it took off. And we were like, we don't need to do this system. We can just use a turned windrow. So it was a great learning experience for our team because someone had told us about this design and we tested it and realized you don't need it. As long as you have a good mix, you're totally fine. This is a couple of forced aerated systems. This is actually a biosolids facility in Maine that's no longer. We don't do the biosolids because of PFAS. So, but this basically what this guy did is he would put his mixture of sludge and shavings together, and then he'd put it over one big pipe, a big 10-inch PVC pipe, and he would attach a manhole ventilator to it, and he'd put a half a tank of gas in and start it up, and he'd leave. When it ran out of gas, that aeration cycle was done. So it was kind of a set it and forget it. And he would do that on a daily basis, one run of gas. And after 21 days, he met his time and temperature standards so that it could then be utilized. So it's kind of a cool idea. So then you get what most people do in Maine, which is a turned windrow. And the typical dimensions are anywhere from 3 to 6 feet high by 10 to 12 feet wide. And the idea is to have a 2-to-1 slope. So that way, when it rains on, it sheds down the sides, but it also has enough surface area and it's not too far from the core that air can penetrate and aerate the pile, which is a good thing. But what turning does is it mixes the piling contents, it rebuilds the structure, and it adds oxygen. But I will tell you that we'll turn a pile and 21% goes in, and within hours, it's back down to only 5%. But that's all the pile really needs to be happy is 5% oxygen. So temperature monitoring is very strongly encouraged, and usually after the first week, temperature monitoring is what helps us make our decisions on when to turn the pile. When I work with farmers, they often don't want to do a daily schedule. They don't have the time. So they've asked for, what is your rule of thumb that I can use? And we'll go with turn once a week after the first week. And that usually works well for farmers. So this is just showing you the equipment. You got a front end loader. You've also got a windrow turner. That's an AeroMaster. That's a really great device. The problem with the one up here, the AeroMaster, is that you have to have the windrow plus a lane for the tractor to go through. So it decreases the amount of space or the amount of windows you can put on a pad because you've got to make those extra lanes. Whereas with an aerated static pile system, you can put piles right next to each other and maximize the number you actually have on the pad. So that's often why aerated static pile is chosen over the windrow turn windrow. But the turn windrow, you're mixing it once a week, so it produces a much more thorough project or a thorough process. So each one has its ups and downs. In vessel is kind of that's the money system. Most of the operations is enclosed and closely monitored. It says it's a faster time because it's optimized. A lot of in-vessel systems have agitation as well. Some of the simpler ones are you put a thorough mix in, drop it in the box, and then you get it out. So it's just a little bit better than an aerated static pile as far as a little more controlled environment. But in general, the batch systems and the aerated static pile systems are about the same as far as what they produce. It's the ones that have agitation that produce a little better product. You get a smaller physical footprint compared to traditional windrow composting. Air is blown in through a blower and it comes out and it's exhausted into usually a roll-off container full of wood chips, and that becomes your biofilter. The mixing that occurs in there with the augers or the agitated beds is so much better. It just makes a much better product. They're insulated to retain heat. That does cost extra money when you buy it. And they do have a leachate capture and collection system where it can either be sprayed back on top or it goes into a collection tank for further use down the road or for disposal. So this is an example of a small version of the Green Mountain Technology earth flow system. You can see they've got an auger over here. This auger is at a 45-degree angle. So as it moves forward, it moves the material back a little bit each day. And depending on the length of the system, it may take anywhere from 10 to 21 days for the material to make it from one end to the other. And each day it's turned and aerated. All the exhaust gas goes into a biofilter, usually a bed of wood chips. So, and these systems can be fairly expensive. The one at the University of Maine cost $125,000 for the system and close to $200,000 for the storage building. And I'll tell you that story in a second. So batch systems, you've got the ag bag. The ag bag works awesome. I've used it on deployments for doing poultry mortalities. It works great. It gets really hot. All the leachate is contained, but it has to go somewhere. The thing that really kind of I don't like is that when you're done, you cut the bag open and the bag is disposed of. And I like systems that reuse things. So I just wish there was a use for that material afterwards. Some farm sites say they do spray it down and they'll use it to put under, cattle feed areas and things to help reduce erosion. But most people they don't want to deal with it because it's kind of sticky and gooey. So they just want to toss it in the landfill. So not necessarily the best thing in the world. All right. Whoops, I think I just did something. All right, let me go back to, I'll go over here. Let me just kill that thing. All right. I think I hit all right, so let's see here. Okay, here we go. So this is a bunch of different drum systems that were created by people. What you do with these systems is you can continuously feed them, but in most cases, they like to do a batch. They fill them up and then they let them rotate around, usually for anywhere from 14 to 21 days, and then they discard it out the other end. The one up top can either be a batch or a continuous fill. But the idea is just that they take care of mixing and odor control during the first couple of weeks. And that's really kind of the benefit of these drum systems. The continuous feed, this is the site down at the old Lewiston Auburn Water Pollution Control Authority biosolids facility. They've since shut down. But the way it worked was that back in the 1993, the EPA developed the sludge Part 503 rules, and they required that composting sludge had to occur for 21 days with an additional 21 days of curing. And that would meet time and temperature standards. And so what they did was this company called Integrated Processing Systems developed a facility that had these tunnels that were 210 feet long. And on top of them were rails where a machine would ride on the rails, and it had a mixing unit in the front, and it would come up through the pile and it would push the material back 10 feet every day. Well, at the end of 21 days, it would come to the end of the tunnel and drop onto a floor to go for curing. So that was your 21 days by being 10 feet, 210 feet long. So it was a really great system. It worked really well. The problem with them, though, is they did not design a biofilter system strong enough. And oftentimes, especially in a state like Maine, where the weather was really cold, you would get tremendous amounts of condensation. And employees would go in there to start the system, and those clouds would be full of ammonia. You can imagine that ammonia comes out of this biosolids material as it's composting. So it created a hazardous situation for the employees. They'd have to almost hold their breath and run and hit the start button and try to make it out before they had to take a breath. So not necessarily the greatest thing in the world. They found ways around it, but it was kind of a design flaw. This is University of Maine up at Orono, and you can see that system is about 47 feet long. That's the expensive one I talked about. It'll process 1 ton of food every single day, which is a good thing. And basically the way that it works is the machine starts at this end, and as it goes forward, you notice the little angle here, it pushes material back. So each day as it comes forward, it pushes material back, creating a void here to be loaded with more food scraps at the next day. And so when it comes out the other end, it looks pretty good. The problem is that the way this system works is it has a chain that drives the auger, moves it side to side, and that chain often will get stretched or break. And when it does, the only way to free everything to work on it is to have somebody jump in and shovel it out by hand. And that's not really super great. So the way that we fixed this for the university is we allowed them in their really super nice building, you see up here, we allowed them to pre-compost the material in these cement bays to make it lighter and fluffier. Then they could put it in the system, and it had less chance of causing the chain to bind up. So it was something we learned. So they built this building to withstand every earthquake, hurricane, you name it. So it was an ideal building to compost in as well. So it worked out really good. So this is that University of Maine system, and see, this is the auger. That's the chain I talked about. It's not awesome, but with the fluffier material going in, we don't see as many problems anymore. But it's right here. The food is dropped in. This thing goes forward. As it does, all this off gas goes into these vacuum tubes and down into a bed of amendment for the biofilter. So it's pretty cool. I like the system very much. Then you've got the rotating drum. This is a company where you can put it in continuously. And once again, the rotation of people think that these things spin fast, and they don't. They rotate very slowly. And that allows for the material to have a lot of intimate contact, allows heat to form, it allows odors to be taken care of. And when it's discharged out the other end, it's not done by any means, but then it can go into a regular windrow, and most of the problems associated with the early onset of composting aren't there. They're taken care of inside the vessel. So it's a great solution if you have the money. These systems are, hundreds of thousands of dollars, but if you have the money, it definitely is another way to go. So dialing it back to Maine for a second, we do have a lot of facilities at Compost. Up here is the University of Maine at Farmington. And this is a town-gown relationship between the Farmington town and the University of Maine. And students bring food scraps over in these containers. But what we've also started doing is we let citizens come on the weekends and bring their food scraps as well. And then we take them down and they're incorporated into these piles. But you'll notice that this pile is pretty big. And the reason why is that you need mass for the winter in order to have it compost through the cold temperatures. There are days when it gets below zero that the outside might get, crusty for about an inch or two. But once it's broken into and it's allowed to get some air, it takes off again. And pretty soon that crust gets kind of melted, and then it's back to business as usual. Over here, I have a school system where it's leaves and food from their cafeteria. And these aren't quite a cubic yard. And so what happens here is it freezes. And in the spring, it thaws. And once it thaws, usually there's probably close to 18, 20 inches of compost. And then the top just is put into a new bin and started all over again. So it isn't really a crime if you freeze in the winter, just as long as you keep moving on the process. So kind of wrapping things up, you need to figure out what kind of system works best for you. And, the first thing is, what are your goals? What do you want to do? If you want to do a community system where it's leaves and grass, and then you want to throw some food in, then just a static pile may be all you want. If you want to do something on a larger scale and make it less potential odors, then you ratchet up to either a Maryland bin system, a turn windrow, or if you're worried about odors, some sort of small in-vessel system, one you build yourself. I'm working currently with the Maine Department of Corrections. They're doing some cool stuff, and they have the ability to manufacture things on site. So maybe in the future we'll have some great ideas coming out of that project. So Right now, the idea is figure out where you want to do it, how much you want to do, and always plan for growth. If you think that you're going to get bigger, then don't pick a site that's very limited. Pick a site that you can expand in the future. Just a common sense thing. And then, do you need a business plan? Are you going to sell this? Are you going to give it away? Do you need to tell the selectmen that this is actually going to pay for itself and here's how? At the Farmington site, we compost year round, and we have 3 sales. We have one in the spring, one in the summer. We haven't done it so much in the last couple of years. COVID kind of killed it, but so one in the spring, one in the summer, one in the fall. The spring one is get your hands in compost and get back to soil. People love that. The summertime is to hit people that have camps on the water, get ready for 4th of July, get your plants all looking pretty. And then in the fall, we say, put your gardens to bed by keeping them active a little bit longer. Let those nutrients get into the microbes, make the soil a little bit better. And then by the time winter hits, you're ready in the spring. You've preloaded with some nutrients and things are looking good. But remember, it's not a fertilizer, it's an amendment, but it does have some nutrients. And then what am I going to do? Am I going to give it away or am I going to sell it? I will tell you that when I work with school kids, I have them put compost in cubic foot plastic bags. They design a little sticker of some cool thing. And then we go to a farmer's market. They sell it for $5 a cubic foot bag. There's 27 cubic feet in a yard. So now you're making $135 a cubic yard selling your compost at the farmer's market. So it is a great way to make some money. And then finally, just make sure you do your homework. Take classes like this. Talk to people. If you're looking at a certain system, ask the person who they sold to recently and reach out to them and say, what do you think of this system? Does it work? Get as many real life experiences as you can. And then finally, there's a lot of good stuff. The composting handbook just came out the last couple of years. It's a really great read. It replaced the old on-farm compost manual. It's super awesome. I'm available all the time to anybody that I train, anybody that's been part of my classes. You can ask me anything. Our compost school is great. You can go to the webpage and look. I won't hawk that. And then Biocycle Connect is the solid waste journal that has been around since the 60s, and it is the Bible for finding cool stuff. So definitely you want to reach out. And then if you're in Maine, absolutely, my partner in all this is Mark Hedrick from the Department of Agriculture, Conservation, and Forestry, and they do really great things. USDA has a lot of cool stuff going on, NRCS, and the list goes on and on, whatever agency you have in your state as well. And I think I just went to a website. All right. Oh, there you go. Sorry, that's the composting handbook. I'm not trying to sell it to you. So let me just kill that. And without further ado, I'll take questions.
Okay, Mark, we have our first one already. Wondering if you could weigh in a bit on positive versus negative aeration. Which one's more common, pros, cons, that sort of thing.
So I talked a little bit about it. The positive aeration is by far the most common. It can be, you can use the most inexpensive blowers. The whole trick to using positive aeration is not to overblow the pile, because if you put too much force through, it'll actually dry the pile out, and then you defeat your purpose. Because once you take away the moisture, you take away the microbial activity. So the induction flow was done to have a very small biofilter as opposed to putting a huge biofilter on a windrow. The problem with the induction is that during the early stages of composting, there's a lot of moisture that's generated, and that moist air is sucked in. So the only kind of blowers you can use are ones that can handle that moisture load. I actually consulted up in St. John, Canada several years ago, where they used induction, and they ended up, the first week, their system failed. And the reason why was because the blowers they got were not moisture capacity capable. And as a result, they all shorted out. And to get replacements wasn't going to happen for a couple months. And so it was a really big hullabaloo. So honestly, I see most people successful with positive. And the more I work with passive and the different things that Mark and I have tried, I'm a fan of that too. So as long as air is going into the pile and coming out the top.
I had a little question while people are deciding if they want to ask a question or not. Did you mention on the university's in-vessel composter what that just like an average cost or something like that? And are there many in the state
Yeah,
using that system?
sure. So we've had many Green Mountain technology options in the state of Maine. We've had the Comptainer that was used by a septic facility in Belgrade, which is basically a 30-yard roll off, but it's like a shipping container with aeration. That's pretty much all it is. But it has computerized, so it's like $65,000. It's insulated, but basically you would put well mixed material in, aerate it, and then take the compost out. We've had what's called the earth tub, which they don't sell anymore, which looks like a big, I can't believe it's not butter container. It holds about 3 yards of compost. It had the same auger. I thought it was great when it was $6,500 for a complete unit, but then they jumped it up to $12,000 and quickly realized they couldn't sell it and they couldn't make it for that. So in its place, they created the earth tub, which you can see on their website, which is kind of small, a little smaller than not the earth tub, the earth cube. It's smaller than the earth tub was, so I'm not a big fan of that. But then they created the earth flow, which is the University of Maine one, and that one cost $125,000 just for the unit. And then the building was another $200,000 to store amendment, and it ended up being their pre-composting building.
Yeah, are there any other questions today?
Well, we started off, before you started, we were talking about municipal strategies or other strategies for dealing with dead deer
Yes,
and carcasses. I don't know if you have time for that.
sure. So what we've done, remember I told you about the roll-off containers? I'm going to tell you why I like these roll-off containers. And in your case in particular, I think it would help you too, James, is you can put the material in, you can tip it back even just a couple of inches. So any potential leachate would go to the back of it, right? So you put it on a cantilever, then you fill it up with the base with about 18 inches of coarse wood chips. Then you put a bed of amendment on top. And I'm a big fan of biologically active material. So I use horse manure. We have a ton of it in Maine. And the horse manure, when it comes out of the stalls, because of all the feces and urine in it, is about 160 degrees. So it is an ideally hot material. I put that on top. Then I lay the carcasses. Usually I split them from the xiphoid right down to the pelvis, pop them open, lay them all together in the middle. Then I cover them with a generous layer of the horse manure on top. Then, in order to augment aeration, I turn that device to where prevailing wind can blow directly into the open door. Now, why, this is a long story short, but why it benefits you tremendously is because when you're done, you shut the door and you can actually have it hauled off site and spread on some farm somewhere. You don't have to, you're not going to give it to people, and you don't have to worry about leachate or any of that stuff. So that may be my next kind of pitch to the solid materials management group, to Eric's group, is that what if we were to do it inside a container? Does that make a difference? So I think there's room for discussion, if that helps.
That was my question too, was here at Downey's Correctional Facility, we're gonna be building our own rotary composter, big drum.
Yep.
So,
Okay, I didn't want to spill the beans on it. I didn't know if it was a secret or not.
yeah. No,
Okay, cool. All right, you can tell people then out of a big culvert, 4-foot diameter culvert.
Yep. We got all the materials, so I'm gonna start construction soon. But is that something that the animals would be able to be composted through as well?
Yeah. What I would think though, because that culvert material it's rugged, but I don't know how super rugged.
Right.
I would almost want to see some size reduction. I don't want to say cut them with the chainsaw, but you know what I mean? Quarter them or do something so that you don't have the whole animal, especially the antlers. You know what I mean?
Right.
I think I'd take the antlers off and put them inside the body cavity. initially because I don't know what's going to puncture one of those because they're pretty rugged, but you never know till you start flipping stuff around where it's going to cause a puncture, and then you get a puncture in it, and you're not going to be happy about that.
Right.
But yes, definitely it could be. And the other thing is that you guys have farmland, right? You grow crops, things like that, veggies and stuff like that.
Yes.
So that piece, you could actually reach out to Mark Hedrick. He's on this call. His phone number is 207 287 7608, and have us come down to do a compost management plan.
That'd be great.
And then that way, that would put you in that category as opposed to a commercial DEP permit.
Yeah, we have an area off-site that we're doing the compost.
Okay.
That it's far enough away from neighbors and roadways that I don't think it would cause an issue, but it'd be great for you to take a look at it.
Yeah, well, and getting the compost management plan just protects you.
Right.
Because it's an agricultural exemption to the solid waste rules.
Yeah.
And that was put in specifically for things like this.
Okay.
Yeah, awesome. No, I think that's great.
So, Mark, we have another question regarding food scraps. If a town's already permitted to do the leaf and grass, or leaves and grass, does that permit by rule let them put some food scraps in? They're worried about attracting animals and such. What can you tell us?
So what we've been doing over the years is we've been allowing the exemption, which is 5 cubic yards a month. We've been allowing transfer stations to also do it. We're going through rulemaking right now, and I've proposed that we make it 10 cubic yard exemption because I think that 5 cubic yards is enough to get excited, but I think 10 is even better. So I think that'll go through. I've pushed pretty hard for it. But the idea is that when you add food scraps to a pile, I didn't really talk about Farmington enough. We do what's called a wind loaf at Farmington, where I'll make a big, huge pile of horse manure. And basically it's 100 yards of horse manure. And I'll make it about 8 feet tall. And what I'll do is when the students come with the food scraps, they bring them in 34-gallon roll-off, 34-gallon tippers. We'll drive over with the front end loader, and they put the bucket just under the tailgate, and the kids dump the food directly into the bucket. And then the loader goes up to the pile 4 feet off the ground and digs a trench with the bucket and tips it into the trench. Then he pulls some of the top cover material over, and we let that sit and precondition. So what happens is that the next day, well, they come every 2 days. The second day, they put one right next to that one, and they go around the whole pile. When they get back to where the first load went, which takes usually 2 weeks, they'll turn the whole pile first, flip it all, and then they dig a trench and start all over again. So we do that for 3 cycles of 2 weeks, and we end up 3 of 2, and then we end up with the material going to curing, where we'll cure it for 3 to 6 months prior to one of our sales. And that's only the material that we'll sell. Now, when we first started, the kids were not good at source separation. So at the end, we would screen out a ton of plates and cups and forks. I mean, we're talking about really good porcelain stuff. And so what the guy that actually I started the process with, he'd box this stuff up. And when people came to get compost, he'd say, "Do you have a camp?" And they'd say, "Yeah. How'd you like to have some plates and cups to go with it?" And he would basically have them all washed and cleaned. And this guy's name was Ron Slater. He was like the greatest guy. And people would be like, "Yeah, I could use some extra plates for camp." So they'd get that as a bonus gift on their way out. Nowadays, the kids are very good at taking all that out. We get a fork and a knife here and there. But what we do get that's very hard to compost are the heads of pineapples. Those things still remain. And people chuckle about it. They'll say, "Yeah, I had to get a couple pineapple heads out of my compost," but they don't care because we charge them $30 a yard, which is really cheap, but also it's kids that do the work, and people love to help kids. So it's just a great story.
Great. Thanks, Mark.
Yes, sir.
Any other questions we have today, or? Oh, feel free to ask Mark later on.
Sure.
We will see hopefully a lot of you folks in April.
All right. Thanks everybody for
Thanks for
attending.
coming.
Take care.